So with 10th edition Warhammer 40K well into its last year now, what do we want to see change for 11th? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking future 40k possibilities, and this time once again taking a look towards the future. In Games Workshop's modern era with their new editions, they've become at least fairly predictable with their timescale. 8th edition and 9th edition were fairly close mirrors of each other, and 10th edition seems to have gone much the same way so far, and it seems very unlikely that Games Workshop's going to deviate from its 3-year release cycle, given that they've been doing that while Warhammer 40k has absolutely surged in popularity, and profits for the company of course. If they stick to their usual timeframes, then that would mean that 11th edition might arrive in around June 2026, which means that we near enough have around 9 months to go of 10th edition left. Obviously that's not a short time, there's time for loads of games yet. I'm sure there'll still be tons more model releases and entire extra codexes like the Drukhari left, but it's still interesting to think about what might be coming in the future. In one of the last videos on the channel I talked through some hopes and expectations for the rest of 10th, both from models and rules. I'll leave that one linked down in the video description, but for this one I thought we could speculate a bit more into the future and what might come in 11th. It's a pretty massive topic, so I thought I might break it down into 3 different videos. One talking about possibilities for game rules, one talking about the overall launch and maybe launch box that we might get, and then one going through each faction in the game and maybe model hopes and desires for a new edition. In any case though, for this one let's talk about some gameplay. As well, 10th edition has been popular and the first edition for a whole load of people out there jumping into the game. It's certainly not been without its criticisms on a number of forms. For this one then, let's talk about some more obvious rules change possibilities for 11th edition, and mainly focusing around some of the bigger points of criticism for 10th. I started out with a whole bunch of suggestions and then asked you guys to suggest a whole bunch more sore spots or things that you might want to change in some way or another, and then did a big channel poll of 500 people to share their opinions as to whether or not they think that that would be a good change or not. I would say that realistically there's never going to be one perfect Warhammer 40k rule set. Different people really look for different things in a rule set, so one change that a lot of people see as positive might be a negative for others, but I still think it's interesting enough to talk about and speculate on what they might do, and roughly how well received it might be if they made certain changes. First up for game rules, perhaps one of the biggest changes is whether or not the shift from 10th to 11th is going to be a soft reset or a hard reset. So basically whether or not all the codexes are going to go away and be superseded, like in the change from 7th to 8th edition or 9th to 10th, or whether it's going to be a more sort of central core rules reset. You keep your codex books, and on edition launch day it's just the core rules of the game that are rewritten, maybe with some digital updates to make current codexes work for new mechanics or adding in some new features, but broadly you keep the books that you were using previously. Either way, it is going to have a few trade-offs. The big hard resets they did at the end of 7th allowed them to take the game in a bit of a new direction. I did feel like there was rather a lot of bloat that had built up with a crazy amount of special rules that they had to try and accommodate each edition, and plenty of models that were just very unbalanced in their codex points. And the same from 9th to 10th, they were able to redesign the game with new stat lines and things. If you don't reset the entire game, then they're going to be a bit more limited as to what they could change. On the other hand though, you could argue that both of those times remove quite a lot of depth from Warhammer 40k. All these fancy codex books with more thought out mechanics that might better reflect a faction's lore and theming, like say all the detachments that we've finally built up to now. If you get rid of them, then the armies are just going to be a lot more straightforward again. In particular though, it's pretty bad feels to have a big expensive rulebook like a codex come out, and then for it to be entirely invalid a fairly short time left. Particularly the World Eaters and the Astra Militarum didn't have a good time with that from 9th to 10th. Their codexes were basically converted into fancy picture books within 6 months. I feel like there's a balance to how often Games Workshop can pull that. I don't really think it would be a good idea to go around releasing an entire edition worth of books and then just to invalidate them every 3 years. I think I'd much prefer to see a soft reset for the 11th edition one, keeping the codexes and changing the core rules and doing some digital errata if they want to add some new mechanics. And it does seem that the majority of you feel that way too. There was about 80% approval for 40k's next edition being a soft reset rather than a hard reset. I guess we do have the precedent of Horus Heresy 3.0 recently. That basically just fully rewrote all the rules in the game only 3 years after they'd done that once previously. I still probably guess they won't do that with Warhammer 40k, though I guess we won't know for sure till that happens. Next up, before in-game rules, there's always criticisms about the rules delivery system. Games Workshop's kind of hybrid system keeps the codexes around and making them relevant, but is also a bit weird in which those books tend to be kind of useless without extensive digital updates. You can't really use them without, so you're sort of referencing rules between 2 sources quite a lot. And it does still seem like that's a pretty spectacularly popular thing to change. When I asked you for approval of whether you wanted a fully digital rule system that's not codex locked, 93% of people said yes, though I guess that is something that could take multiple different forms depending on what Games Workshop were feeling like. We have experienced that quite recently in 10th edition. The rules were digital and free at the 10th edition start, then paywalled gradually by the codexes for the factions at least. You can access the rules digitally, but only with a codex code if you go and buy a physical book. I haven't bothered to support all aspects of the game in digital rule sets, such as not doing legends in the app. Obviously, I guess the holy grail of rules access will be free online rules access. So just if any new player to the game wants to check out the rules for any faction in 40k, they can just do so without having to buy an expensive rulebook and put codes into apps and things. Though given that Games Workshop's got away with the codex model of doing things for quite so long, and to me at least there's still a bit of nostalgia about the codex and their delivery themselves, I'd just be kind of surprised if they decide to let that go. It's really quite a reliable source of sales and rules, even if it's a bit of a detriment to people actually wanting to go out, learn and play the game. If they did do an online digital rule set, it's almost certainly going to get paywalled, I guess. I've certainly heard people saying that if it was available permanently to Warhammer Plus, people would be a bit more likely to subscribe to that, though whether or not it's good value would depend on how much you play and the prices, I suppose. In any case, feels like there's pretty great appetite for Games Workshop shifting their rules to being more online. Before I move on to some other proposed rules changes, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titan's Terrain. They're one option to get a battlefield worth of Warhammer 40k terrain on the go. They do things a bit different to most with their folding cardboard designs for their ruins and things. The idea for their terrain set is that you basically have 12 tiles making a 45 by 60 inch grid, so the right size for a 1000 point or 2000 point 40k. Each of those tiles unfolds and then up pops a pop-up cardboard building. So the main advantage is that you have an entire battlefield that can be stored completely flat and fit inside a box the same size as a standard board game. The biggest advantage for that is for people who don't have a huge amount of space at home and might struggle to store and warehouse a bulkier terrain set, or say if you want to transport the terrain around so you're going for a game at a friend's house, it's not going to take up much space and you can have a pop-up battlefield on the go when needed. As you'd expect, it's far cheaper than Games Workshop terrain as well, and comes pre-coloured so no hobby work needed to put it down. It is a bit of an unusual design, and there are definite trade-offs versus other sets, which I'll talk about a bit more at the end of the video. But for those who want to take a look over their stuff, there'll be links down in the video description, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Next up, there were really quite a lot of suggestions about the general size and vibe that a Warhammer 40k game should be. One suggestion that cropped up at least a bit was going back to the old standard 40k table of 48 inches by 72. I believe it was 9th edition where they pared it down to 44 by 60. It is still really quite a big gaming table, might be too big for tables that you might have at home. I don't know if it was partly Games Workshop trying to speed up the game a bit and maybe improve the amount of places that you could play Warhammer 40k on comfortably, or perhaps just turn gaming tables like that so you have a bit of sideboard to put armies down on when you're setting up, which isn't the worst thing in the world. All that has had some in-game effects though. There's less scope for units deploying really far back in deployment zones, which I guess is one of the things that's helped melee against shooting armies a bit in more recent editions. In 8th and previous it did tend to be rather a bit shooting dominated for the average forces, though I'd say it's maybe been one of the factors that's maybe pushed Warhammer 40k into a little bit less of a wargame feel. Perhaps a little less scope for grand manoeuvres and multiple turns worth of actions, having first to push towards enemy positions and try and get the right sort of interactions on the table before actually dealing damage. Seems like there's at least some appetite for bigger tables, though it's very, very mixed. From the channel polls, it was an even 50%, broadly 1/3 wanting bigger tables, 1/3 wanting to stick with the ones that we had, and 1/3 not really caring. I would personally be pretty surprised if Games Workshop increased them though, perhaps more from a quality of life and ease of access to 40k as much as anything else. I'd personally be happy to stick with what we have now we've made the change, maybe not least with the amount of people with battle mats and gaming supplies to fit that board size. Another talking point that's come up at least a fair few times throughout 10th edition is how big a typical game should be in terms of the amount of models that you put on the table. Generally the game size that gets talked about the most is the sort of standard 2000 point games, though it's not the only way to play Warhammer. 2000 points just seems to be the way that Games Workshop has designed the game to be perhaps a bit more balanced, with most armies having enough stuff to sort of function properly and have good answers to the other things in enemy armies. Though in reality, of course, lots of people play smaller games than that, lots of 1000 points played casually, and it was nice to see a little bit of tailor-made support for that, with dedicated cards in the recent chapter approved. I feel like one common thread that's often been talked about for armies in 10th though, are that quite a lot of armies feel like you need more models than you did previously. It's maybe not literally every single faction that's had this problem more so than in previous editions, but there definitely are some armies that feel a bit painful with just how much you could field with them. Maybe Tau Empire being a particularly good example in 10th. A lot of their battle suits and things just don't do quite as much on the tabletop as what they used to. with things like a Riptide dropping down from 250 points or so to 190, and maxed out Crisis Suit combos being far cheaper than what they used to be. It just means that lots of armies might need a huge amount more models and a lot more expense to play a 2,000 point game of 40k compared with what they did. And if Games Workshop wanted to, they could certainly nudge things a bit more so you didn't need quite as many miniatures to play their more standard sized game. Even if it was, say, effectively decreasing the points to 1800 points of what it was now. They effectively did this in the soft reset between 8th edition and 9th edition. Throughout 8th, their main way of balancing things was to give points cuts to units, so that meant that you had this same problem happen again. And then in the transition to 9th, points just generally went up for every single faction across the board, as they wanted to nudge it slightly so the most standard sized game of Warhammer 40k didn't have quite as big a model requirements. I feel like that change wasn't enormously well received at the time, mainly just due to a lot of maybe slightly lesser well-informed players just thinking that their army was being nerfed relative to the rest, where it was more like if everything goes up in points then effectively nothing has. Again, for channel polls it seems that people were a bit more mixed on this one. Plenty of people pretty happy to stick with the points totals that we have at the moment, and of course you can always play smaller games if you want to. There also seems like there's a fair amount of people who wouldn't mind playing at a very slightly lower points cost effectively, or having the points of models go up a touch. Speaking of points, that brings us to army construction in general, and one of the very biggest and most controversial changes they did at the start of 10th edition was removing points granularity, which they did seem to have been gradually winding down throughout 10th edition as well. The two biggest changes were locked squad sizes and free war gear, so going from previously when you bought in one model per X amount of points, going to 10th edition where you either buy the bigger or the smaller unit, and rather than paying individual costs for war gear, they just made literally all war gear free in the game. So you could always choose the biggest, most impactful and most exciting stuff, which does have some positives but also some downsides. I'd say maybe one of the biggest negatives was just the fun factor of micromanaging the decisions and unit selections that you took when list building. Say whether or not you'd upgrade your units with special weapons to give them some extra punch or put the points into something else. Maybe a level of granularity that some people enjoyed in the theory crafting but others maybe a bit less so. Beyond fun factor, the era of locked unit sizes and free war gear do have some design limitations though. Non-upgraded squads are basically going to be strictly suboptimal unless they have some sort of clever way of giving them a special rule to help them out. There's some choices of war gear that are just absolutely clear auto-includes, like say taking sponsons on every single Lehman Russ now. It's maybe a shame not to have some flexibility over squad sizes in sort of middle points brackets, and it can be a bit awkward to use up some of the last points in an army list, as you don't just have the option of adding in an extra heavy weapon or two. For all the flaws though, I do feel like the new points for 10th edition did have some big positives too. Really easy list construction. Units that are very product and box set links isn't the worst thing for newer players, so they're not scrambling around to find odd parts that all the more experienced players have gradually managed to acquire to make their units more optimal, so they might be on a bit more of a level playing field straight away. Plenty of war gear choices out there can be pretty well balanced with stat lines, just changing the stat lines so they're just genuinely good against different targets, but there's no one that's flatly superior. And admittedly, even before, when they had points cost, there would usually be choices that would get taken time and again. Even if, say, a multi-melter cost a few more points, it could still be well worth it versus anything else. It does mean from a balance point of view as well, if one single unit gets too good or too bad, they can easily just nose up the points or down a little bit until they see a bit more play or aren't quite so overtuned. And on the fun factor side of things, prior to the new point system, you often saw just bare bones squads on quite a lot of units, as a lot of the fancy fun upgrades just cost a bit too many points to really bother with. And I guess at least with 10th edition points, there's no feels bad for assembling all the fun special weapons and giving your squad a bunch of interesting extra stuff, even if they're just basic troops aimed to hold some objectives. I was quite interested to check in on people's sentiments after an edition playing this way. I asked you a couple of different questions on this one. It seems that approval was kind of low for a full reversion to paying points for all models and bits of war gear as we had previously. But sentiment was broadly pretty positive. They're having a bit more of a hybrid system, paying points costs for certain war gear choices that are just clearly not well balanced against each other, and that always do tend to be, just given gun profiles have to be kind of similar across a lot of units, and not all things that you can model units with are equivalent. This does seem something that might be possible that they could decide to do. Games Workshop had a Warhammer Plus interview about Warhammer 40k design around a year or so back, I think. And kind of surprisingly, they did very specifically say that they felt that certain bits of war gear should have a points cost associated with them if they were really quite a big upgrade, and that's just something that isn't the case in 10th edition. That bit just strongly implies to me that we will get some sort of hybrid system in 11th, or at least that was their thinking at the time. I feel like that would be at least a fairly good, feels good option, just maybe to balance out a few of the more auto-include choices, so they're a bit more of an optional factor versus the weaker version, or not going overboard and paying for literally every single grenade and special weapon. Next up, along with free war gear and locked squad sizes, another one of the big simplifications that 10th edition made was in character construction. In 8th and 9th edition, generic characters tended to be pretty powerful. You could have a combination of a relic and warlord trait, and then also combine with a choice of points for war gear as well. It meant you could often have pretty stacked melee characters in one way or another, combining 2 fighty traits and some big bits of war gear, or just a whole bunch more thematic choices that weren't locked to say 4 different enhancements worth of options. In 10th edition, Games Workshop went for maybe a slightly weird and very model kit and product focused version of Warhammer 40k rules. So we had things like Farseers being treated differently if they're on a jet bike or on foot, and even get completely different psychic powers that the other one can't take. I guess it might have been a good thing for characters being a bit more balanced and not having weird unintended combos that just sort of break the game in various different ways. By having so many different interactions between character, relic, warlord traits, and war gear cost, it just meant that you could never really have a good balance where lots of different things were viable. You'd often have characters that were just kind of broken or overly strong with a min-max set of traits versus ones that were just really quite underpowered if you didn't go quite down the big set power combo, and that could be kind of boring in its own way. There were also often other layers of complexity such as selecting psychic powers or chaplain litanies and things which could take things further. In general, in 10th edition though, I feel like having that sort of RPG style character customization is perhaps a little bit lacking, and people would be pretty happy to see a return of more complex character construction. You guys responded with a solid positive for more customization to characters and leaders when asked. At the moment, quite a lot of that is locked to Crusade and narrative rules in 10th edition, I suppose. I'm really not too sure what Games Workshop might go down in terms of ways to implement that. It certainly seems like it could be something that they could add a layer of depth in 11th edition codexes, maybe having some sort of points upgrade that was generic to multiple different characters like you often had in the front of books back in 9th, or maybe a more expansive list of enhancements that's not just locked to 4 per the detachment. While we're on army construction, that does seem to be an area that people would just quite like to see a bit more of, expanded core rules for each army. Currently we have the system where everything is contained within a detachment besides the one core rule for an army currently. At the start of 10th, that certainly felt like it was going to make detachments really quite powerful in defining the way that an army played, even when the changes might be subtle. But also perhaps means that Space Marines don't really have so many generic options, like say for example, if you want them all to be able to access Armour of Contempt, you have to have that take up a stratagem slot in every single detachment, which perhaps limits the fun stuff that you could do. Feels like you could maybe have, say, something like 2 or 3 core stratagems per faction that they just get regardless of detachment, and that's the way that they operate. And you could do similar for some enhancements and maybe other areas of rules. Again, you might not want to go quite as overboard as some of the rules bloke got in 9th edition, but after an edition of rather slimmed down rules that's locked to a couple of pages, I think some people would happily tolerate a little bit more complexity. Otherwise, with army construction things, I was interested to get some opinions on things like reversion to a force organisation chart, or whether or not people wanted to go with detachments in general or go back to sort of sub-faction rules, so represent ultramarines or bad moons or things. I feel like plenty of people do have rose-tinted glasses for when 40k had 1 HQ, 2 troops and then expand from there. It doesn't seem desperately popular that people want to see it turn up again though. I guess 10th edition has managed to do quite well with a really quite free-form army construction, where after the balance tweaks, armies tend to look more like armies than they sometimes did in the past, and hasn't really had a need that stopped people from, say, going down really big themes of armies if they want to. I feel like it's probably a strength of the rule system if you can, say, bring a great big tank spam army. Occasionally it might do well, but it's probably not going to be the strongest thing in the world, and the balance of the game sort of encourages you to have units to fill different roles. The detachments versus sub-factions thing is an interesting one they could revisit. I feel like maybe the detachment themes aren't quite as strong as the sub-faction themes, so if you know that your army is playing Ultramarines and they fight in a specific style, that's maybe a bit easier to get your head around theme-wise as opposed to what a Vanguard Spearhead does. But at the same time, for people collecting those armies, it's quite nice that they're just able to use all the rules in the codex, as opposed to being locked one way or the other due to paint scheme, as Games Workshop occasionally enforced in the past. At least from these ones, you guys seem like you'd be more happy to stick with detachments as opposed to change back to that. For another more radical change that 40k has had proposed on numerous occasions, there's the option to change to alternating activations from the I go you go turn system at the moment, the one where you roll for first turn, one player activates with everything, and then the second player waits around and then activates in turn. I go you go has been the way that 40k has always been, and to move away from that would feel like you're changing into quite a different game system, but there's also no reason that you couldn't do that, and it's just the way that more modern game systems tend to go. So usually in all sorts of different forms of one player moves and activates one unit, then the other player does one of theirs until all are activated. It means that you might have a few more moves and counter moves on the go with units repeatedly jumping on each other and attacking. and having a bit of a mix between the value of getting first strikes and things, and also still setting things up for turn-on-turn strategy. It's one that seems to get floated around just about every time Games Workshop does an update. I'm sure lots of people would enjoy seeing alternate activations. It looks like people are fairly mixed from the poll that I did. I think personally I could pretty happily go either way. I certainly enjoyed trying a Warhammer 40k edition where they decided to go for alternating activations. It'd certainly be one big thing that they could use to sell a new edition if they wanted to. That would legitimately make it a different gaming experience, and on paper it could be an improvement given that so many other wargames use it. But on the other hand, Warhammer 40k has come this far and been this popular with I Go You Go, and if anything at the moment that's something that makes it more of a defining feature of the game system as opposed to many of the other games out there. And I guess you could just argue that changing from I Go You Go could just make it more conformist to everything else. Either way, it seems to be another one where plenty of people would enjoy, many people really wouldn't, and many people don't really care either way. Next up, for a maybe slightly nebulous one, I asked people whether or not they want to make games faster to play in Warhammer 40k, and perhaps for something that seems like more or less an objective positive, this one had kind of lukewarm reception, at only around 60% approval, which if anything maybe makes me feel that people aren't super fussed about this as a big priority. I guess you can play Warhammer 40k at different points levels, and if time is a factor then Incursion or Combat Patrol are very doable at much smaller time frames. I'd say in 10th compared with certain other editions, tournament games going to 3 hours or so hasn't really been a particularly big issue. You still get games that go overtime, though I suspect that you're always going to some extent, and that Games Workshop generally want to try and trim bloat from their system if they want to add other fun stuff in. As realistically, there's only so many rules, interactions and details that two players playing a game can reasonably handle within a certain time frame. At the start of 10th edition, they did say there'd be fewer rerolls. I'd say maybe compared with 9th, that has been the case, even if they have wound up adding loads in. In 9th edition, you'd often have characters with multiple stacking aura abilities, and it being at least fairly common to have aura bubbles where everything rerolls all hits, and then wound rolls of 1 or something. In 10th edition, I think they did take out a bunch of that, but at the same time, lots of the codexes have wound up adding it in one way or another. Say, for example, we've got entire detachments where you do just have reroll hit rolls of 1 as one core benefit, like the Tyrannid's recent Subterranean Assault one, and plenty of units have it built in as just something that they do all the time. In that same 40k design interview that they did last year, they mentioned not being huge fans of layered save rolls, such as say a Feel No Pain roll after the regular saving throws. I think you could argue that that's something that slows the game down a bit. It does feel like in 10th edition they've decided to remove some army-wide Feel No Pains for certain factions. For example, Death Guard still don't have it anymore, and the toughness just reflected by their stat lines. And the Imperial Knights recently lost Feel No Pain across their detachment. That's certainly not the only thing that drags game time though, and there's plenty of other stuff out there. Perhaps another thing that changed in 10th edition was the decision paralysis of loads of different secondary objectives. It feels like even with the objective cards there's a bit less bookkeeping than there used to be. But on the other hand, you could have a super fast game that was also super simple, so it's a balance between it including fun stuff and more depth. For example, another time-saving thing that happened between 9th and 10th edition was the removal of the psychic phase, and that feels like that's a contrast between speeding the game up a bit and streamlining things down versus removing one extra area of rules that maybe added a bit of a different feel to the game. Speaking of which, at the start of 10th edition, that was another one of the things that was the most criticised. Basically the way that psychers and psychic powers were being handled this time around, just going from something that was really quite its own defined thing and felt a bit other compared with the rest of the game, to just being more folded into more basic datasheet abilities and buffing rules, not really any different to how say a captain might command sometimes, or damage profiles with a psychic keyword that maybe had a little bit of fun and risk factor with hazardous, but otherwise function like any other weapon with the exception that certain things counter them due to the psychic keyword being a negative. In 9th edition we came from the system where you had to roll to cast and enemies could roll to deny if they were in range with their own psychers or denial units. As it went with psychic systems in 40k's history, I felt like the 9th edition system of doing things was about as good as it had got. Certainly quite a bit better than 7th edition, kind of horrendous rolling for powers at the start of the game, and the big warp dice battery thing that you had. I quite like the way that it was fairly board positioning relevant, so you often had to get within 18 inches to cast most of the psychic powers, but enemy psychers could have at least some sort of limited go at denying at 24 inches, and that meant that you had a bit of interplay there. Having the rolls for psychic tests just meant that you had a bit more high risk, high reward, and made Perils of the Warp feel like a bit more of its own thing as opposed to the hazardous test or the datasheet rules now, or at least I'd argue. I feel like this also had a bit of overlap with character customization as well. You went from psychers generally being able to pick from say 6 different spells out of a psychic discipline, to basically just having say 1 or 2 powers locked to their datasheet and their physical miniature, and no more. I feel like the general vibe in 10th edition is that people would like to see a bit more fun factor in psychic powers. Maybe whether or not there actually needs to be an entire psychic phase is a bit more in question. Okay, it looks like people were kind of split as to whether or not the psychic phase needs to come back, though maybe I should have asked a bit more about the mechanics for psychic things. I guess you could still have a system where you had psychic tests to activate a certain powerful ability in the phase that was relevant to it, and maybe you could have some sort of system to try and deny powers. I feel like maybe the issue with that one in the past has been that there's certain armies that just have naturally large amounts of psychers that might be able to provide some defense, when some have basically none at all, or just a few gizmos from the lore. So it might be kind of hard to balance factions playing against other psychic factions where there's a bit of interplay with cast and deny rolls, and then psychers versus certain non-psychic armies where they basically get most of their abilities off just completely easily. It does seem like it's kind of hard to balance for both of them. I think I'm also maybe a bit mixed as to whether or not a psychic needs to be its own phase. I think I wouldn't be against some sort of system of rolling to cast to make it feel like you're casting a psychic power, and psychers being able to choose their powers in some way, shape or form with a bit of character customization, if they could implement it well of course. Next up, on what feels like one of maybe the single biggest criticisms of 10th edition, has been the terrain system and the L-shaped tournament ruins that it maybe encourages more than others. And as you can see, this one looks like a very popular to see Games Workshop do something about. The problem is at the moment is that current 40k with the balance of range versus melee and alpha strike things just doesn't really function very well without really quite a lot of terrain, to the point where it feels like a lot of boards more feel like they're playing city fights. If you tried to play 40k on a bigger, wider open map, then usually armies with range damage and a lot of firepower that's long range will generally triumph over armies that fight in melee. Perhaps the slightly frustrating thing is that this has all come about because of legitimate criticisms in the game's past. In 8th edition, terrain layouts tended to be far less formalised, and a lot of the time terrain just didn't really do anything much. True line of sight often meant that everything could see everything if there were some ruins with some windows, and people in general wanted terrain to have more of an impact in games and be more meaningful as a result. The I go you go system means that first turn advantage can be a really real thing. And if you want a more fair game to the person going second against a gunline army, you're going to want to have an adequate amount of terrain that they can hide a significant portion of their units behind so they don't just get shot off the board turn 1. There's the need to balance shooting versus melee, so generally melee armies are going to want some highly dense terrain to hide in if they possibly can. They actually at least get a bit more chance of moving up and getting into close combat to deal damage. Lots of 40k melee units just aren't really that tough, or not really supposed to be that tough. Say things like Eldari Aspect Warriors, and if you don't have powerful terrain rules and screening, they're just going to get absolutely obliterated in shooting before they get anywhere near close. And then while that might encourage a whole bunch of terrain on the board and things that block line of sight, the L-shaped ruins in particular tend to get played a lot as they don't take up vast swathes of the board and stop movement within them. So tanks, monsters and vehicles can basically move behind them pretty well, so you don't have a boxy building taking up some valuable real estate where you could move models around on the board. Plus they also don't create sort of magic box style things where you might have infantry or characters sheltering in the very midst of them, and a monster or vehicle being completely unable to interact with them. Between all that, it feels kind of understandable why L-shaped ruins and lots of terrain have taken over 40k a bit. But I certainly think it'd be a big win if Games Workshop could manage to shake up the formula and make 40k more playable on more varied terrain sets. Maybe just a really obvious one could be to give more things the obscuring special rule, so say woods for example. There's no real reason that woods couldn't have the same obscuring line of sight rule as the ruins had, and that is something that I've seen people house rule plenty in the past. Otherwise though, if you wanted to make 40k a bit less city-fied and a bit more open, you might just generally have to reduce the amount of lethality in the game, or add some things to limit shooting at Alpha Strike, like maybe a night fight style mechanic like they've sometimes had in the past. For all it being a bit boring, it does feel like the current terrain set does solve quite a lot of problems out there in 40k, so any fixes to it are probably going to come with some sort of trade-offs or need other fixes to help them out. It would be pretty nice to have a bit more focus on being able to play 40k in a more balanced form on varied terrain sets that people are likely to have outside of tournament standard terrain though. I touched on this a second ago, but maybe making Warhammer 40k less lethal could be one way to reduce the dependency on line of sight blocking ruins to have a balanced game. Current 40k often tends to play as a bit of a unit trading game, units hiding safe behind ruins and then jumping forward to deal damage and do objectives and things, and then once they're exposed they very rapidly turn from being exposed to being dead. The opponent might have to move units forward to take them out in turn. That means that on high levels of terrain and tournament play, you might often get 40k armies sort of engaging each other piecemeal. Lots of individual squad on squad or squad on vehicle style interactions, as opposed to armies moving forward on a more whole front out in the open. Potentially if you wanted to shift the game to be a bit more grand strategy and moving units forward out in the open and dealing damage to each other as they get closer, then you could perhaps try and make the game less lethal but encourage a little bit less line of sight blocking terrain than currently. But again, that probably would have trade-offs. In general, people want their units to have some good damage dealing effect, particularly fragile ones that are likely to do some damage and then die. There are still plenty of things in current Warhammer 40k that can be an absolute slog to take down. Maybe things like Custodia's armies, Deathwing Knights, or a Great Unclean One. There's plenty of things already in the territory where it might be best to try and ignore and manage them, as opposed to outright destroy them in terms of in-game strategy. And I feel like for most people, you probably want to have the reasonable expectation that over the course of a standard game length, one side is able to fully wipe out the other if things go well for them. It just maybe feels a bit more satisfying than a game where two armies have marched up to the mid-board and flailed at each other a bit, not really dealt all that much damage, and then one side wins on points. In any case, it doesn't really seem to be universally accepted that 40k is too lethal in any way, and people seem to be pretty balanced on the polls. Next up, and again one of the single most criticised aspects of 10th edition has been leadership and Battleshock, though I feel like this is just literally something that comes up pretty much every single edition. Usually more that leadership is just not meaningful enough, but on the other hand, whenever it gets too reliably meaningful, that's not generally a great thing for people, as you don't really want your superhuman, well-trained killing machines just running for the hills at a moment's notice. I feel like compared with previous editions, I like the feel of Battleshock a bit more than some of the leadership things that have come before, either losing individual models running off from the fight, or occasionally entire units in the past. Entire units, breaky or not, often felt a bit arbitrary if you say had some space marines that just ran off the board because they happened to be towards the board edge. And the individual model system that we had in the not too distant past again felt a little bit on the arbitrary side, with some models deciding to leg it or vanish completely, where the majority of armies just didn't really care too much about leadership for one reason or another. I think for 40k purposes, where in general most armies tend to be pretty committed to their causes, having a system where you're sort of pinned down and shell-shocked under fire seems like it's a bit more representative than units full-sail routing. Battleshock definitely does have impact in 10th edition, though maybe kind of rarely. And still the factions that have rules that really quite heavily revolve around it don't really tend to get loads of strength from those rules, like maybe Chaos Knights or the Night Lords detachment. One thing that I've seen floated in the past is the option to make Battleshock units have to test to regroup in the command phase. That's at least mean that a bunch of datasheet rules that hand out Battleshock tests, like say Infernus Marines or various bits of artillery out there, might have a bit more impact. At least if they fail the first time, there's at least some chance they fail the second time, rather than just automatically regrouping often after literally nothing has been achieved. Actually, a separate poll question for that, and that one got a 59% approval, so maybe a weakish approval. Some people would like that, but some people would like other things, I suppose. I think I would just be very, very surprised though if Games Workshop introduced any leadership system in the game that's actually well liked and both impactful and not particularly feels bad. I feel like Battleshock's better than some of the previous ones we've had in the past, personally. Finally, just to round off, one thing that Games Workshop have done in 10th is to deliberately keep aircraft and fortifications really quite niche in terms of power level. Maybe to some extent indirect fire, though I feel like that's kind of on the borderline, where still every so often you get armies that suddenly want to spam it if it suddenly becomes the best indirect fire in the game, even if its damage output isn't super high. Certainly for the aircrafts and fortification though, the design has been really quite clear for balance with them. If they ever wind up cropping up in strong lists to any sort of extent with any frequency, then generally points go up for the aircraft, and for all the ones that basically never get played, points never seem to go down. I don't think that generally people would really want either aircraft or fortifications dominating the experience in Warhammer 40k. Both of them are a bit non-interactive, the fortifications don't move and tend to be a bit tough, so you might be best off to ignore them a lot of the time. Other aircraft, often in hover mode, you might literally not be able to interact with them if you're playing a very melee-heavy army. Never mind their potential for, if they get good, being super good for alpha strikes and things. It still feels like it's maybe a little bit on the weak side to basically just accept that these ones are never going to be part of a strong Warhammer 40k army list, or try and limit it as much as possible. There are some pretty cool models in both lineups, say the Chaos Helldrake or the Astra Militar and Valkyrie. They're both ones that are really quite loved by their collectors, and I think people would like to see them treated a bit more mainstream. And some of the fortifications are quite fun as well, say the Hammerfall Drop Bunker or the Orcs Big Head Boss Bunker. Just feels like if they put a bit of thought into it and a bit of time, they could probably make a system where it might incentivize you maybe take one of them and it's a good idea, but then have some sort of system, whether it's a hard cap or a scaling points value or similar, that means it's generally not a great idea to spam them and have them completely dominate a 40k game. Finally, whenever editions are redone alongside things like force organisation charts, you have suggestions for previous rules mechanics too. Maybe two ones that feel very old school 40k are the return of armour facings and blast templates, both mechanics that have a good bit of fun factor, but also tended to be a little bit on the imprecise side in their own ways. Having armour facings with tanks able to be damaged more or less easily depending on what sort of arc you were in was pretty fun. They could often just be a little bit fiddly to resolve if you had, say, a unit a really long way away that was right on the borderline between two facings and trying to decide which arc they were shooting in, particularly when several 40k tanks maybe aren't super obvious as to where you'd measure the front corners to. Blast templates feel pretty fun, punchy and evocative. Really nice to see the actual explosions happen and then chunks get taken out of infantry formations. They also had downsides as well though, with scatter dice again being a little bit less precise, and things could look really quite different based on the angle that you view them from the two different sides of the table. Plus I must admit I didn't really like the aspect of blast templates that basically meant that you had to try and spread your forces out as much as possible if you wanted to take less damage from them. I guess that makes sense, but also means that you're really disincentivized to field good ranked up infantry, which I think looks really quite good on the board. Blast did maybe feel a bit better for realising maybe truly massive weapons like Titan scale ones, which under current rules tend to only affect certain units though. Overall it seems like both of these have more people in favour of keeping them out of current 40k as opposed to bringing them back. I kind of feel like Games Workshop has sort of deliberately divided their game systems to have some that more appeal to nostalgia and the things that came before, as opposed to slightly more modern wargaming trends. For 40k it feels like if you want to play with blast templates and scatter dice and things, their aim is for you to play Horus Heresy, even if obviously that's a different game system with different models to what you can use in 40k. In any case, lots of stuff to talk about, loads of potential things they could change if they wanted to. Let me know what you'd want to see or not want to see in a change from 10th edition to 11th edition when it inevitably turns up. I'll look forward to hearing all your comments down below as always. Finally, I'll just round off the video by saying a quick thank you to Titans Terrain once again, makers of their pop-up cardboard terrain set. I quickly talk through some pros, cons and some of their specific box sets. As mentioned earlier, I feel like with their pop-up cardboard design, they do have some more obvious pros and cons versus other terrain sets out there. Obviously it's really quite easy to store and transport due to it being able to fold flat. I'd say that's the biggest USP. It is far cheaper than a board of Games Workshop terrain, though that's certainly true of most third-party terrain sets. It's somewhat comparable to MDF. It doesn't need any painting or assembly, being ready to go immediately. Could be useful for people who want to save their hobby time for their armies. It does come with some downsides and trade-offs though. It's a bit less sturdy and hard wearing versus plastic and MDF given it's made of cardboard and designed to fold flat. It's not as easy to put miniatures in the upper floors of ruins and things as a result. They don't bear a lot of weight. The grid layout can make things a bit less flexible than some. It might be worth adding just a little bit of extra terrain on top of it to break up some firing lanes, as it can create those for 40k. It doesn't really make tournament approved layouts if that's what you're going for. I still say that overall it's a solid enough option for casual games of 40k. For their main offerings, they've got two primary ones in stock at the moment. Their Forgotten Furnace is a Chaos Foundry style one. Lots of factories and glowing runes and obelisks and things. And then they've got a more standard Ruined City Shattered Hive style set, this one having some more bombed out buildings and armoured containers and the like. They do have some expansion and centerpiece sets for each of those as well. A Ruined Reliquary for the Shattered Hive, and then a great big Infernal Spire for the Chaos one, and that's basically pushing two tiles together to make one great big building. In any case though, thanks to them for sponsoring the video, and feel free to check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to. In any case though, I'll leave that there for now. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I certainly aim to keep the Warhammer 40k videos coming with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel and check out the Patreon page linked down in the video description, channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and then automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.